Thank you, Ms. Rodan Benzakin. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank each of you for your extraordinarily powerful testimony here today. Mr. Carr, when you served in the State Department under the Trump administration, you had insight into the roles that our nation's adversaries played in stoking anti-Semitism across the globe, including in Europe. What can you tell us about Russia's efforts to deepen anti-Semitic divides in Europe, and what are Russia's objectives in doing so?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. Russia's efforts in these regards are extensive, deep and wide. Russia primarily employs anti-Semitic agitation in its neighbors, not so much because President Putin himself has made anti-Semitism a focus of his leadership within Russia, but rather as a form and weapon to destabilize neighboring countries and to allow Russia then to claim that these neighboring countries are fascist and therefore need to be denazified or somehow cleaned of fascist and anti-Semitic tendencies. During a particular uptick in anti-Semitism in Poland, as measured on the social media, Ambassador Mosbacher at the time and I met in Moscow about this, and it was determined by our embassy that a substantial portion of anti-Semitic posts on social media in Polish were done by bots and suspected to be of Russian origin. There is no question with regard to Ukraine that not only anti-Semitic posts on social media, but actual anti-Semitic attacks, vandalisms, various anti-Semitic agitation and foment, even leading to physical violence, were performed by Russian allies within Ukraine. Now, this is not to say that there isn't anti-Semitism in Poland and Ukraine. There certainly is. There's anti-Semitism everywhere, as we know, sadly. But there is little doubt and incontrovertible proof that Russia is engaged in an active campaign of anti-Semitic agitation among its neighbors, especially the neighbors that President Putin regards as hostile to Russian interests.
And can you please describe Iran's efforts to promote anti-Semitism?
Iran, as you correctly and powerfully pointed out in your opening remarks, Mr. Chairman, is the world's chief state sponsor of both terrorism and anti-Semitism. It is an exporter of anti-Semitism throughout the world. It is funding anti-Semitic movements and anti-Semitic agitation in multiple countries. Through Hezbollah, its terrorist proxy in Lebanon, Lebanese schools are awash with anti-Semitic sewage of the worst kind, indoctrinating children to hate Jews and to devote themselves to martyrdom, much as we've seen in the schools of Hamas and in UNRWA textbooks, as Rabbi Cooper correctly pointed out. This now extends to Latin America, where Iran and Hezbollah both have substantial networks and are promoting destabilization in those countries and actually terrorism in those countries. And so Iran is a leading source of anti-Semitic foment. And by the way, it is important to note that Iran's chief defense of its malevolent conduct is that it's not anti-Semitic at all, but merely anti-Zionist. And this, by the way, should teach all of us a lesson about this false distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Hatred of the Jewish state is hatred of the Jewish people. It's really quite simple. And to try to nuance that is to do a deep disservice to the fight against anti-Semitism. And Iran is an anti-Semitic country, the regime, I should say. The Iranian rogue regime is an anti-Semitic regime. And incidentally, when it took power, one of the first things that Iran did is execute the leader of the Iranian Jewish community. And its anti-Semitism has continued unabashed, unchecked, and unconstrained every year since its murder of the leader of Iran's Jewish community, which is one of the many reasons why Iranian mischief as a threat to global Jewry, to peace and stability in the world, to the United States. And I very much hope that the recent disasters that we've seen in the world will lead the United States to reevaluate its Iran policy and really bring people together around a strong policy to contain the mischief of one of the world's most dangerous regimes.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Dr. Levitt, Iran and its proxies in Lebanon, Gaza, and elsewhere are leading exporters of anti-Semitic hate and violence. Additionally, the IRGC has helped plan attacks against Jewish communities in Europe. Do Hamas and Hezbollah derive financing or support from Europe? And what could be done, what more could be done by the European governments to block this support, and how can the U.S. help?
Thank you for the question. Both Iran and Hezbollah get a tremendous amount of money, plus weapons, intelligence, and other support directly from Iran. But they both also fundraise in Europe. And just today, there is a meeting in Europe, and the U.S. government is represented there in an effort to build together a task force to more productively and proactively target Hamas financing in Europe. This is to complement an effort that's already been going for a few weeks now, post-October 7th, involving U.S. Treasury's FinCEN, our financial intelligence unit, and the financial intelligence unit in Israel and elsewhere, several in Europe. To do this, it's incredibly important because in the case of Hamas in particular, Hamas's budget got more money from its control of the Gaza Strip over the past few years than any other source, even including the amount of money it got from Iran. To the extent that the Israelis successfully end the Hamas governance project in the Gaza Strip, they will lose access to those hundreds of millions of dollars, and they will therefore be even more reliant on things like abuse of charity, which is happening in Europe as we speak. Hezbollah has a much bigger budget and is a much bigger threat. It also engages in abuse of charity around the world, including in Europe. But its criminal activities in Europe are extremely important, and we have been having, over at least the past two administrations, much more law enforcement cooperation from the Europeans than we've had in the past. But as you've heard from my colleagues, it's going to be exceptionally important going forward to build on that, to get all of Hezbollah, not just the quote-unquote terrorist wing designated within the European Union, to get the IRGC designated within the European Union and within the UK.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt. And Rabbi Cooper, you and Ms. Rodin Ben-Zaken both mentioned the fact that the EU has no tolerance laws on the books, but there are, we need to stand up against hate crimes and on definitions, the monitoring of online hate speech and online anti-Semitism, and ensuring that law enforcement has the tools necessary. Can either of you be a little bit more specific in some of the things that we need to do in that regard?
Well, if you allow me just to start, I can tell you that I'll be in Berlin again tomorrow, and we're going to be pursuing a relationship with the police, people who trained the trainers. Our Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles has already trained over 200,000 law enforcement, domestically and overseas. So we can add to that, but really the most important element everywhere is a signal from the political establishment that anti-Semitism is important. So for example, as we know, the challenges from terrorism and the targeting of Jews in France goes back to the Joe Goldenberg massacre in the 1980s. It's not a new phenomenon. But in recent decades, I think we have to give the police in France pretty good grades for doing their job. But the judicial system in France refuses to even put the murderers of elderly Jewish women permanently in jail, let alone hold others culpable if they come from the bottom of the socioeconomic range. A lot of politics and ideology seep into the judicial system so that French Jews don't have a confidence in the system. In Germany, There are a lot of laws on the books, but as one example about Iran's kind of nefarious influence, they created a holiday from a Muslim holiday from whole cloth called Al-Quds Day, which is about taking back Jerusalem from the Jewish people and having the Muslim world control. And the demonstrations that took place on the streets of German cities, year after year, despite our protestations and other Jewish organizations, that was the first time since the Hitler era in which death to the Jews was chanted in Germany. That was a seed, a poison seed that was planted by the Iranians, and it's taken this long for Germany and other countries to wake up to it. And I think as long as we're talking about it as well, let's remember that Iran is a state that sponsors, that pushes the denial of the Shoah, Holocaust denial. It doesn't stop them from using Holocaust imagery to demonize Jews in the Jewish state and to mock the victims of the Holocaust. But when you have the full power of the state behind a big lie, as we know from, tragically, from our Jewish history, terrible things can happen. And we live in an era today in which everything local is global and everything global is local. So whether it's Al Jazeera from Qatar or Al-Manar from Hezbollah, using their substantial reach into the Arab and Muslim world, they're the ones who are getting that poison opportunity to spread that poison seed across European societies and democracies. And I would just say, in terms of Germany, for example, the focus really needs to be on the younger people, the children of the immigrants, to try to reach them and explain to them in the 21st century why, as a citizen of Germany, it's important for them to understand what happened in the Nazi Holocaust and what steps, as good citizens, they need to embrace in order to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Thank you. Ms. Vodan-Bezaken?
I mentioned earlier on the need for a zero-tolerance policy. There are indeed great laws in Europe, across the European continent, far more stringent laws than here in the United States. But one of the big problems, as was just mentioned, was that they are not really always applied, and this absolutely needs to change. There is, when you create a feeling of impunity, when people have the impression that they can basically say or do whatever they want, this only creates further anti-Semitic acts. And so it absolutely starts with the social media. Under the DSA, so under the Digital Services Act that was voted by last year by the European Union, social media platforms have an obligation of transparency and have an obligation to remove content when it contravenes European laws. Despite the fact that there is such a huge amount of anti-Semitic content online, the social media companies are today not really obliged. So they will get a letter from the European Commissioner alerting them about the situation, but there are no real consequences. There are no real consequences in terms of financial consequences, and there are no real consequences in terms of potentially being shut down at some point. So there needs to be a very clear message to social media companies that they have a responsibility. We know that the path between words and beliefs and actual acts exist. We know it because we have experienced it in the past here in the United States and even in New Zealand and of course in Europe, where we know that people have become radicalized online, people have expressed their anti-Semitism, their racism, their radicalization online, and then have actually acted upon it. So there absolutely needs to be a very clear zero-tolerance strategy, especially because we have seen that when things are being done, they bear results. I'll give you one example. France was one of the only countries that at the very beginning, after October 7th, because it had experienced times where there were horrible anti-Semitic acts in times whenever Israel was facing Hamas, decided to shut down anti-Semitic, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel demonstrations in the streets of Paris, Marseille, and elsewhere. And it produced results. When you look today at the world, including here in the United States, France is probably one of the only countries where you have very little anti-Semitic demonstrations in the streets of France. So whenever the country actually sends out a very clear message that there are consequences when people behave in an illegal way, it works. So my recommendation is and has been to European governments to actually use the laws that they have and just apply them.